In the winter of 1823, 15 young men studying to become ministers at a remote Pennsylvania seminary died within 6 weeks of each other. Each death followed the same horrifying pattern: violent convulsions, speaking in tongues, and a peculiar blackening of the fingernails that physicians had never seen before. The official cause of death was listed as consumption, but the local doctor who examined the bodies refused to sign the death certificates. He claimed the symptoms matched no known disease, and more disturbing still, he discovered something in their blood that made him burn his medical notes and flee the county that very night. The church authorities sealed the seminary immediately, forbidding anyone from entering the grounds, and the 15 bodies were buried in unmarked graves behind the chapel. For 2 centuries, the Presbyterian Church has refused to discuss what happened at Whitmore Seminary, but recently discovered letters from a surviving student reveal a truth so disturbing that it explains why some secrets are meant to stay buried forever. Before we continue with the story of Whitmore Seminary and uncover what really killed those 15 young men, I need to tell you something important. This channel isn't for everyone, only for the bravest souls who dare to seek the truth behind America's darkest mysteries. Few channels dare to tell the stories we tell here, stories that have been buried by institutions and forgotten by time. If you've made it this far, you're not like most people. You're someone who needs to know what others are afraid to discover. So hit that subscribe button and join the select few who know these secrets. And tell me in the comments, what state are you listening from? Are you brave enough to hear mysteries from your own backyard? Now let's return to that cursed winter in Pennsylvania, where something far more sinister than disease was claiming young lives. The story begins in the rolling hills of western Pennsylvania, where the Presbyterian Church had established Whitmore Seminary in 1819. Named after the Reverend Josiah Whitmore, a prominent minister who had died fighting in the Revolutionary War, the seminary was built to train the next generation of Presbyterian ministers for the expanding American frontier. The institution sat on 200 acres of pristine woodland, with a main building constructed of local limestone and a small chapel that could seat 50 people. Surrounding the main complex were dormitories, a dining hall, faculty housing, and a working farm that provided food for the community, all connected by cobblestone paths that wound through towering oak and maple trees. The seminary attracted young men from across Pennsylvania and neighboring states, drawn by its reputation for rigorous theological education and its affordable tuition. Most students came from farming families or small towns, eager to serve God and bring civilization to the wild territories beyond the Appalachian Mountains. The curriculum was demanding. Students studied Greek and Latin, biblical exegesis, systematic theology, homiletics, church history, and practical ministry skills. They attended chapel twice daily, maintained strict schedules, and were expected to live lives of exemplary moral conduct. The selection process for students was rigorous, requiring letters of recommendation from local ministers, evidence of academic preparation, and a detailed testimony of their calling to ministry. The Presbyterian Church took seriously its responsibility to train godly men for the frontier, where ministers often served multiple congregations across vast distances and faced challenges that required both theological knowledge and practical wisdom. In the autumn of 1823, 43 students were enrolled at Whitmore Seminary. The eldest was 28-year-old Marcus Hartwell, a former schoolteacher from Lancaster County who had felt called to ministry after his wife died in childbirth. Marcus was a serious, contemplative man who had read extensively in theology and philosophy before coming to the seminary. His fellow students respected him for his maturity and often sought his counsel on both academic and personal matters. The youngest was barely 18, Timothy Brennan, the son of Irish immigrants who had scraped together every penny to send their boy to seminary. Timothy's father had died in a mining accident when the boy was 14, and his mother had worked as a seamstress for 4 years to save enough money for his education. Timothy carried the weight of his family's sacrifices and was determined to succeed, often studying late into the night by candlelight. Between them were farmers' sons like Samuel Brewster, whose family had worked the same land in Lancaster County for 3 generations. Samuel was known for his robust health and cheerful disposition, always ready with a joke or encouraging word for his classmates. There was also Peter Cunningham, a quiet young man from western Pennsylvania who had been raised by his grandfather after his parents died of fever. Peter was intensely pious and spent hours each day in private prayer, often fasting and seeking divine guidance for his future ministry. James Morrison came from a well-to-do Philadelphia family that had initially opposed his decision to enter the ministry. His father, a successful merchant, had wanted James to join the family business, but the young man had felt an irresistible call to serve God. James was articulate and well-educated, with a particular gift for languages that made him one of the seminary's best students in Greek and Hebrew. Thomas Millikan, whose family had settled in Pittsburgh in the early 1800s, was known for his intellectual curiosity and his tendency to ask probing questions that sometimes made his professors uncomfortable. Thomas had read widely beyond the required curriculum and was fascinated by the theological controversies that were beginning to emerge in American Presbyterianism. He was particularly interested in the relationship between reason and revelation, and how the church should respond to new philosophical ideas coming from Europe. David Crane, who would later become the sole survivor of the group's terrible ordeal, was a practical young man from a farming family in central Pennsylvania. He had been drawn to ministry not by dramatic religious experience, but by a steady conviction that God was calling him to serve. David was well liked by his classmates for his reliability and common sense, though he sometimes struggled with the more abstract theological concepts that came easily to students like Thomas and James. The head of the seminary was Dr. Cornelius Ashford, a stern but fair man in his 50s who had studied at Princeton Seminary under the renowned theologian Archibald Alexander. Dr. Ashford had been personally recruited by the Presbyterian Church to establish Whitmore Seminary, and he had brought with him a reputation for scholarly excellence and pastoral wisdom. He demanded excellence from his students, but was known to be genuinely concerned for their spiritual and intellectual development. Dr. Ashford lived on campus with his wife Margaret and their teenage daughter Sarah. Margaret Ashford was a cultured woman who had been educated at a female seminary in Philadelphia, and she took an active interest in the welfare of the students, often inviting them to dinner and providing maternal guidance to young men far from home. Sarah, 18 years old and possessed of both beauty and intelligence, was beloved by the students for her kind nature and sharp wit. She often helped in the seminary's library and had read more theology than many seminary graduates. The seminary's faculty included Professor Jonathan Hartley, who taught Greek and Hebrew and was known for his exacting standards and dry wit. Professor Hartley had spent several years studying in Germany and brought continental theological perspectives to his teaching, though he was careful to maintain orthodox Presbyterian positions. There was also Professor William Sterling, who taught church history and homiletics. Professor Sterling was a gifted preacher who had served several large congregations before accepting his teaching position, and his lectures were among the most popular at the seminary. The autumn of 1823 had been particularly harsh. Early snows had fallen in October, and by November, the seminary was already isolated by drifts that made travel to nearby towns difficult. The isolation was not entirely unwelcome, as it created an atmosphere of intensive study and spiritual reflection that the faculty encouraged. The students had settled into their winter routine of concentrated academic work, their days filled with lectures, prayer, and preparation for the spring examinations that would determine their fitness for ordination. The atmosphere was one of quiet scholarship and devotion, with the only sounds being the scratch of quills on parchment, the rustle of pages, the soft murmur of evening prayers, and the occasional crack of logs in the fireplaces that heated the buildings. The seminary's library contained over 3,000 volumes, including works by Calvin, Luther, Edwards, and other Reformed theologians, as well as commentaries, church histories, and works of practical theology. Life at the seminary followed a strict schedule that had been carefully designed to promote both academic excellence and spiritual growth. Students rose at 5 in the morning for private devotions, a practice that Dr. Ashford insisted was essential for maintaining spiritual vitality. Morning prayers were followed by breakfast at 6, a simple meal of porridge, bread, butter, and milk that was eaten in silence while one of the students read from a devotional work. Classes began at 7 and continued until noon, with subjects ranging from biblical languages to church history to systematic theology. Professor Hartley's Greek classes were notorious for their difficulty, and students often spent hours preparing for his recitations. Professor Sterling's church history lectures were more popular, as he had a gift for bringing ancient controversies to life and helping students understand how past theological debates affected contemporary church life. Afternoons were reserved for study and preparation, with a brief break for physical exercise when weather permitted. The seminary maintained a gymnasium of sorts in one of the outbuildings, where students could engage in calisthenics and other approved forms of exercise. More popular were walks through the surrounding woods, which provided both physical activity and opportunities for reflection and prayer. Evening chapel was held at 6 o'clock and was attended by all students and faculty. Dr. Ashford typically preached, though visiting ministers and senior students were sometimes given the opportunity to deliver sermons. The services followed traditional Presbyterian liturgy, with psalm singing, prayer, scripture reading, and preaching. The chapel itself was a beautiful space with tall windows that let in the afternoon light and a simple but elegant pulpit carved from local walnut. After evening chapel, students gathered for communal study time in the library or their dormitory common rooms. This was a time for discussion of the day's lectures, collaborative work on assignments, and informal theological debate. The conversations were often intense, as young men grappled with complex theological questions and prepared themselves for ministries that would require them to provide spiritual guidance to others. Students were expected to be in their rooms by 9 o'clock, though many continued studying privately until much later. The dormitories were spartanly furnished but comfortable enough, with each student having a small room containing a bed, desk, chair, washstand, and a small bookshelf. The buildings were heated by large fireplaces in the common areas, though individual rooms could become quite cold during the harsh Pennsylvania winters. Students were expected to maintain their own quarters and assist with general upkeep of the seminary grounds. The surrounding community of Millbrook was small but supportive of the seminary's mission. The town consisted of about 300 souls, mostly farmers and craftsmen who provided goods and services to the seminary. There was a general store, a blacksmith shop, a grist mill, and a small Presbyterian church where Dr. Ashford sometimes preached when the regular minister was away. The townspeople took pride in having the seminary in their midst, and often attended special events and graduation ceremonies. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came on the morning of December 3, 1823. Thomas Milliken, a 22-year-old student from Pittsburgh, failed to appear for morning chapel. This was highly unusual, as Thomas was known for his punctuality and had never missed a chapel service in his 2 years at the seminary. When his roommate David Crane went to check on him, he found Thomas writhing on his bed, his body contorting in violent spasms, while unintelligible words poured from his lips. But what struck David most was not the convulsions or the strange utterances. It was Thomas's fingernails, which had turned completely black as if they had been dipped in ink. David immediately called for help, his shouts echoing through the dormitory corridors and rousing other students from their morning preparations. Within minutes, several classmates had gathered in Thomas's room, their faces pale with shock and concern as they witnessed their friend's inexplicable suffering. The convulsions were unlike anything they had ever seen. Thomas's back arched so severely that his body formed an almost perfect bridge, and his limbs jerked with such violence that it took 3 students to hold him down and prevent him from injuring himself. Dr. Ashford arrived within minutes, having heard the commotion from his residence nearby. The seminary's head was a man who prided himself on maintaining composure in difficult situations, but even he was visibly shaken by what he observed. Thomas's eyes had rolled back until only the whites were visible, and the words pouring from his mouth sounded like Latin, but were twisted into something that seemed to mock the very prayers the students had been taught to recite. Dominus vobiscum infernum, Thomas repeated over and over, his voice growing more guttural with each repetition. Corpus diaboli, anima perdita. The words were recognizable as Latin, but they formed phrases that no Orthodox Christian would ever utter. Dr. Ashford, who was fluent in Latin from his theological studies, felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that Thomas was speaking in blasphemous inversions of sacred liturgical phrases. Dr. Ashford immediately summoned the local physician, Dr. Edmund Whitley, who lived in the nearby town of Millbrook. A messenger was dispatched on horseback through the snow-covered roads, with instructions to bring the doctor back as quickly as possible. While they waited, Dr. Ashford led the gathered students in prayer for Thomas's recovery, though their voices trembled with uncertainty and fear. Dr. Whitley arrived within 2 hours, his medical bag in hand and his face grim with concentration. He had been practicing medicine for over 30 years and had seen his share of strange ailments, but what he witnessed at Whitmore Seminary that day would haunt him for the rest of his life. Thomas's symptoms defied everything Dr. Whitley knew about medicine. The young man's pulse was rapid and irregular, sometimes racing so fast it seemed his heart might burst, then suddenly slowing to an almost imperceptible rhythm. The doctor's examination revealed other disturbing symptoms. Thomas's breathing was labored and accompanied by a strange whistling sound that seemed to come from deep within his chest. His skin had taken on a peculiar grayish pallor that Dr. Whitley had never seen in any living patient, and there were dark veins visible beneath the surface that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. The black discoloration had spread from Thomas's fingernails to his entire hands, and similar dark patches were appearing on his neck and around his eyes. Most disturbing were the words he spoke during his convulsions. The Latin phrases were consistently blasphemous, inverting traditional prayers and liturgical responses in ways that suggested either profound theological knowledge or some form of supernatural influence. Dr. Whitley, though not a deeply religious man, found himself deeply unsettled by the precision and consistency of Thomas's blasphemous utterances. Dr. Whitley administered laudanum to calm the convulsions and applied cold compresses to bring down the fever, but nothing seemed to help. He tried bleeding Thomas, following the medical practices of the time, but the blood that flowed from the incisions was darker than normal and seemed to coagulate almost immediately. He attempted to induce vomiting to purge any potential toxins, but Thomas's stomach produced only a foul-smelling black bile that stained the basin and filled the room with an odor like rotting eggs. Throughout the day, word of Thomas's condition spread through the seminary community. Students gathered in small groups, whispering prayers and theories about what might have caused their classmates' strange illness. Some suggested it might be a form of consumption, though none had seen consumption present in such a bizarre manner. Others wondered if Thomas had been bitten by some venomous creature that had somehow survived the early winter, perhaps a snake or spider that had taken refuge in the warm dormitory buildings. A few of the more superstitious students began to mutter about divine judgment or demonic possession, though Dr. Ashford quickly silenced such talk. He reminded them that they were training to be ministers of the gospel and that they should seek rational explanations for unusual events rather than resorting to superstition and fear. However, even Dr. Ashford found himself struggling to explain Thomas's symptoms in purely medical terms. As evening approached, Thomas's condition continued to deteriorate. The convulsions became more violent, and the blasphemous Latin phrases gave way to sounds that seemed barely human. Sarah Ashford, despite her father's protests, insisted on helping to care for Thomas, bringing fresh water and clean linens. She was struck by how cold Thomas's skin felt to the touch, despite the fever that was clearly ravaging his body. The other students maintained a prayer vigil throughout the night, taking turns reading scripture and offering intercessions for their friends' recovery. The atmosphere in the dormitory was one of profound sadness and growing fear as the young men grappled with the possibility that they might lose their classmate to this mysterious ailment. Thomas Millikan died at 3 o'clock in the morning on December 4th, exactly 21 hours after the first convulsions began. His final moments were marked by a sudden return of consciousness and clarity that startled everyone present. The convulsions stopped, his eyes focused, and he looked directly at Dr. Whitley with an expression of profound terror and regret. His final words, spoken in a moment of clarity just before his death, were recorded by Dr. Whitley in his medical notes. The book in the chapel. God forgive us all. The words were spoken with such intensity and conviction that everyone present felt their significance, though none understood what Thomas meant by them. Dr. Whitley noted that Thomas's voice had returned to its normal tone for these final words, in stark contrast to the guttural sounds that had emerged during his illness. After speaking these words, Thomas's eyes closed, his breathing stopped, and his body relaxed into the stillness of death. The black discoloration began to fade from his skin almost immediately, leaving behind only the pale complexion of a young man who had died far from home and family. Dr. Whitley examined the body thoroughly, noting that many of the strange symptoms had disappeared with death, as if whatever had afflicted Thomas had departed with his final breath. The funeral was held 2 days later, with Thomas's body laid to rest in the small cemetery behind the chapel. Dr. Ashford delivered a moving eulogy about the young man's devotion to his studies and his desire to serve God on the frontier. He spoke of Thomas's intellectual gifts and his passion for theological learning, traits that had made him a favorite among both faculty and students. The service was attended by all the students and faculty, as well as several townspeople who had come to know Thomas during his time at the seminary. Many wept openly as they said goodbye to their friend and classmate. Timothy Brennan, the youngest student, was particularly affected by the loss, as Thomas had served as something of an older brother figure to him. Marcus Hartwell delivered a prayer at the graveside, asking God to receive Thomas's soul and to grant comfort to those who mourned his passing. But even as they mourned Thomas's death, a sense of unease had settled over the seminary community. The strange nature of his illness, the rapidity of his decline, and his final cryptic words had shaken everyone's sense of security and normalcy. Dr. Whitley had assured them that whatever had killed Thomas was likely an isolated incident, perhaps caused by spoiled food or exposure to some unknown toxin. But his words rang hollow in the face of such unusual symptoms. The winter seemed to press in around the seminary with renewed intensity after Thomas's death. The snow fell more heavily, the winds howled louder through the trees, and the buildings seemed to creak and groan under the weight of the cold and the weight of grief. Students began to complain of strange dreams and difficulty sleeping. Some reported hearing footsteps in the corridors at night, though investigation always revealed empty hallways. The atmosphere of quiet scholarship that had characterized the seminary began to give way to something more anxious and fearful. Professor Hartley noticed that his students seemed distracted during their Greek recitations, their minds clearly elsewhere despite their efforts to concentrate on their studies. Professor Sterling found that his church history lectures, usually received with enthusiasm, were met with worried faces and absent stares out the windows at the dark winter landscape. Dr. Ashford tried to maintain normalcy by adhering strictly to the seminary's schedule and encouraging the students to find comfort in their studies and devotions. He increased the frequency of chapel services and arranged for special prayer meetings focused on seeking God's comfort in times of trial. But despite his efforts, the shadow of Thomas's death hung over the community like a dark cloud that refused to lift. What none of them realized was that Thomas Millikan's death was only the beginning. The true horror would unfold over the following weeks, claiming life after life in a pattern so precise and methodical that it would challenge everything the survivors believed about disease, death, and the nature of evil itself. 3 days after Thomas's funeral, on December 9th, another student began showing the same terrifying symptoms. James Morrison, a quiet young man from Philadelphia who had been Thomas's study partner and closest friend at the seminary, woke his roommate with the same violent convulsions that had marked Thomas's final day. The convulsions began at exactly 3 o'clock in the morning, the same time that Thomas had died. A coincidence that would not be lost on those who witnessed both events. The pattern was identical in every detail. The same black fingernails appeared within hours, the same twisted Latin phrases poured from his lips, and the same grayish pallor spread across his skin like a shadow. James's roommate, William Foster, immediately recognized the symptoms and ran to fetch Dr. Ashford and Dr. Whitley, his bare feet slapping against the cold dormitory floors as panic gripped his heart. Dr. Whitley was summoned again, this time with a growing sense of dread that had settled in his stomach like a cold stone. He had spent the days since Thomas's death researching every medical text he could find, seeking some explanation for the bizarre symptoms he had witnessed. He had written to colleagues in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, describing the case and asking for their insights. But nothing in his extensive library or correspondence offered any clues that could explain what he had seen. The blackened fingernails, the convulsions, the strange vocalizations. Taken individually, each symptom might have had a rational explanation. Poisoning could cause convulsions. Certain diseases could affect the circulation and cause discoloration, and delirium could lead to incoherent speech. But together, they formed a pattern that seemed to exist outside the bounds of known medicine, a combination of symptoms that appeared in no medical textbook Dr. Whitley had ever studied. As Dr. Whitley examined James Morrison, he was struck by the precise similarity to Thomas's condition. Not only were the symptoms identical, but they appeared to be progressing at exactly the same rate. The black discoloration spread from the fingernails at the same speed, the fever followed the same pattern of intensity, and even the specific Latin phrases were repeated word for word. It was as if James was following some predetermined script that had already been written by Thomas's illness. The students who gathered to witness James's suffering were now openly terrified. The coincidence of two identical illnesses occurring so close together had shattered any remaining hope that Thomas's death had been an isolated incident. Whispers began to spread through the dormitory about curses and divine judgment, though Dr. Ashford continued to insist on rational explanations and discourage superstitious speculation. James Morrison died exactly 21 hours after his symptoms began, just as Thomas had. His final words were identical. The book in the chapel. God forgive us all. The precision of the timing and the repetition of the same final message sent a chill through everyone present. Dr. Whitley had begun to suspect some form of contagion, though he had never encountered any disease that produced such consistent symptoms and timing. The possibility of contagion led Dr. Whitley to order that James's body be prepared for burial immediately and that his personal effects be burned as a precautionary measure. He also instituted quarantine procedures, requiring that anyone who had been in close contact with either Thomas or James be isolated and monitored for signs of illness. The dormitory where both men had lived was sealed and fumigated with sulfur smoke, a standard practice for dealing with potentially infectious diseases. The students were now openly terrified, their fear palpable in every conversation and visible in every face. 2 deaths in a week, both following the same horrifying pattern, had shattered their sense of safety and normalcy. The seminary, which had been a place of learning and spiritual growth, now felt like a trap from which death might emerge at any moment to claim another victim. Dr. Ashford attempted to maintain order by increasing the frequency of chapel services and encouraging the students to find comfort in prayer and study. He arranged for additional prayer meetings and Bible studies, hoping that increased devotional activity might provide both spiritual comfort and practical distraction from their fears. He also wrote to the Presbyterian church authorities in Philadelphia, informing them of the situation and requesting guidance on how to proceed. The response from Philadelphia was swift and decisive. The Reverend Dr. Jonathan Blackwood, a senior administrator in the Presbyterian Church, was dispatched immediately to investigate the situation and provide assistance. Dr. Blackwood was known for his calm demeanor and practical approach to crisis management, having dealt with various emergencies in Presbyterian institutions throughout Pennsylvania and New Jersey. But before Dr. Blackwood could arrive, the pattern repeated itself again. On December 12th, 3 days after James Morrison's death, it happened a third time. This time the victim was Samuel Brewster, a 25-year-old from rural Lancaster County who had been known for his robust health and cheerful disposition. Samuel had been one of the most popular students at the seminary, always ready with a joke or encouraging word for his classmates, and his illness sent shockwaves through the entire community. The pattern was identical in every terrifying detail. Violent convulsions beginning at 3 o'clock in the morning, blackened fingernails, twisted Latin phrases, grayish pallor, and death exactly 21 hours later. Samuel's final words were the same as his predecessors. The book in the chapel. God forgive us all. The repetition was now so precise that Dr. Whitley began to document every aspect of the illness, hoping to find some clue that might explain the impossible consistency. Dr. Whitley had now witnessed 3 deaths that followed the same impossible pattern. As a man of science and rational thought, he struggled to accept what he was seeing. The symptoms defied medical explanation, the timing was unnaturally precise, and the final words suggested some shared knowledge or experience that connected the victims in ways he couldn't understand. He began to suspect that the deaths might not be natural at all, but he had no framework for understanding what else they might be. The arrival of Dr. Blackwood on December 15th brought some measure of relief to the beleaguered seminary community. Dr. Blackwood was a man in his 60s with silver hair and penetrating blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He had served the Presbyterian Church for over 40 years and had dealt with everything from financial scandals to theological controversies. He immediately took charge of the situation with the authority and confidence that came from decades of experience. Dr. Blackwood immediately convened a meeting with Dr. Ashford, Dr. Whitley, and the senior faculty to discuss the situation and develop a plan of action. He listened carefully to Dr. Whitley's detailed account of the 3 deaths, asking pointed questions about symptoms, timing, and any potential connections between the victims. He also interviewed several students who had been close to the deceased, seeking any information that might explain the mysterious pattern. His assessment was pragmatic and decisive, though privately, he was deeply troubled by what he had learned. Dr. Blackwood concluded that the seminary was dealing with some form of highly contagious disease that had not yet been identified by medical science. While he had never encountered anything like the symptoms Dr. Whitley described, he had seen enough epidemics to know that unknown diseases could sometimes emerge and devastate communities before doctors understood how to treat them. Based on this assessment, Dr. Blackwood ordered that the institution be quarantined immediately, with no one allowed to enter or leave the grounds until the epidemic had run its course. He sent word to the Presbyterian Church authorities in Philadelphia, explaining the situation and requesting that prayers be offered for the seminary community. He also dispatched letters to the families of all students, explaining the quarantine and assuring them that every precaution was being taken to protect their sons. The quarantine order transformed Whitmore Seminary from a place of learning into a prison of fear. The students, now numbering 37 after the 3 deaths, found themselves trapped with whatever was killing their classmates. The normal rhythms of academic life became secondary to the constant vigil against death. Every morning brought the terrifying question, who would be next? Dr. Blackwood had taken up residence in the faculty building and assumed overall authority for managing the crisis. He was a man of firm faith and practical experience, but even he seemed shaken by the precise pattern of the deaths and the mysterious final words that each victim had spoken. He established a strict schedule of prayer services, hoping that divine intervention might halt whatever was claiming the students' lives. The daily routine under quarantine was carefully structured to maintain both order and morale. Morning chapel was extended to include special prayers for protection and healing. Classes continued, though professors struggled to maintain academic focus when everyone's thoughts were consumed by fear and grief. Dr. Blackwood instituted a buddy system, with students paired to watch over each other and report any sign of illness immediately. The fourth death came on December 18th, claiming Peter Cunningham, a quiet student from Western Pennsylvania who had kept largely to himself since arriving at the seminary. Peter had been known for his intense piety and long hours of private prayer, often fasting and seeking divine guidance for his future ministry. His illness began at exactly 3 o'clock in the morning, following the same terrifying pattern that had become grimly familiar to the seminary community. The convulsions, the blackened fingernails, the twisted Latin phrases, and the grayish pallor all appeared on schedule, as if Peter's body was following some invisible script written by the deaths that had come before. Dr. Whitley documented every detail, noting that even the specific Latin phrases were identical to those spoken by the previous victims. The precision was beyond anything that could be explained by natural disease or coincidence. Peter Cunningham died exactly 21 hours after his symptoms began, and his final words were identical to the others. The book in the chapel, God forgive us all. Dr. Whitley had begun to focus intensely on these final words, convinced that they held the key to understanding the mysterious deaths. The reference to a book in the chapel was specific and consistent, suggesting that all 4 victims had shared some knowledge or experience related to this mysterious book. The mention of a book in the chapel had begun to intrigue not only Dr. Whitley but also Dr. Blackwood, who had extensive experience with theological controversies and church discipline. Both men understood that dying words often carried special significance, and the consistency of the message across 4 different victims suggested that it was not merely the product of delirium or fever-induced hallucinations. Dr. Blackwood approached Dr. Ashford about conducting a thorough search of the chapel, but the seminary's head was reluctant to disturb the sacred space based on what he considered the ravings of dying men. Dr. Ashford argued that the chapel was the heart of the seminary's spiritual life, and that searching it would undermine the students' faith and confidence in the institution. He preferred to focus on medical solutions rather than pursuing what he saw as superstitious speculation. However, Dr. Blackwood's experience with church controversies had taught him that dying words often revealed secrets that the living were reluctant to acknowledge. He had investigated cases of clerical misconduct, financial impropriety, and theological deviation, and he knew that religious institutions sometimes harbored dark secrets beneath their pious exteriors. The consistency of the dying words, combined with the inexplicable nature of the deaths, convinced him that a thorough investigation was necessary. By December 20th, the seminary was in the grip of full panic. The students had begun to refuse meals, convinced that the food might be contaminated with whatever was causing the deaths. They huddled together in small groups, reading scripture and praying constantly, their voices rising and falling in desperate pleas for divine protection. Some had begun to show signs of nervous exhaustion, jumping at every sound and crying out in their sleep. The faculty struggled to maintain order and continue the educational mission of the seminary, but the atmosphere of terror was becoming overwhelming. Professor Hartley's Greek classes were attended by hollow-eyed students who could barely concentrate on their recitations. Professor Sterling's church history lectures were interrupted by sudden prayers and outbursts of fear when students thought they heard sounds in the hallways. Several students had begun writing letters to their families, begging to be allowed to leave the seminary despite the quarantine order. Timothy Brennan, the youngest student, had written to his mother expressing his fear that he would never see her again. Marcus Hartwell, the eldest and most mature student, had taken it upon himself to provide leadership and comfort to his younger classmates. But even he was struggling with the constant pressure of living under the shadow of death. It was on the night of December 20th that the first break in the pattern occurred, though its significance would not become clear until much later. David Crane, who had been Thomas Milliken's roommate and had witnessed the first death, approached Dr. Whitley with information that would change everything they thought they knew about the mysterious deaths. David was visibly shaken and seemed to be struggling with some internal conflict as he sought out the doctor in his temporary quarters in the faculty building. His hands trembled as he knocked on Dr. Whitley's door, and his voice was barely above a whisper when he asked if they could speak privately. Dr. Whitley, exhausted from days of futile medical efforts and growing dread, invited David into his room and offered him a chair. What David revealed was a confession that he had been carrying for weeks, a secret that he had been too frightened and ashamed to share even as his friends died one by one. He told Dr. Whitley that he and several other students had been part of a secret study group that met in the chapel after evening prayers. They had been reading a book that Thomas had discovered in a hidden compartment behind the altar. A book that none of them had seen before, and that seemed to contain knowledge beyond anything they had learned in their regular studies. The revelation hit Dr. Whitley like a physical blow. Here, finally, was a connection between the victims beyond the timing and symptoms of their deaths. If they had all been part of this secret study group, their deaths might not be random at all. They might be connected to whatever they had been reading in that mysterious book that each victim had referenced in their final words. David's hands shook as he described the book and the group's activities. According to his account, the book was bound in what appeared to be human skin, though none of them had wanted to examine it too closely. The pages were made of some form of parchment that seemed much older than anything else in the seminary's library, and the text was written in a mixture of Latin and symbols that none of them could fully identify. The discovery had been made by Thomas Millikan during routine maintenance work in the chapel in early October. The seminary's buildings were old and required constant upkeep, and students were often assigned to help with minor repairs and cleaning. Thomas had been working alone in the chapel one evening when he noticed that one of the stones behind the altar seemed loose. When he investigated, he found a hidden compartment that contained the mysterious book, along with several other items that appeared to be very old. Thomas had been immediately fascinated by the discovery and had shared it with his closest friends, James Morrison, Samuel Brewster, Peter Cunningham, David Crane, and Marcus Hartwell. The 6 young men had formed a secret study group to examine the book and attempt to decipher its contents. They began meeting twice weekly after evening prayers when the chapel was empty and the faculty had retired for the night. According to David's trembling testimony, the book appeared to be some form of advanced theological text, but written in a style and language that seemed to predate anything they had studied in their regular curriculum. The symbols and diagrams scattered throughout the text suggested knowledge of spiritual practices that went far beyond Orthodox Presbyterian doctrine. The Latin text was interspersed with Hebrew words and strange symbols that resembled no alphabet any of them had encountered. Thomas had been convinced that the book contained secret wisdom that could enhance their understanding of divine mysteries and make them more effective ministers. He argued that God had led him to discover the book for a purpose, and that they had a responsibility to study its contents and unlock its secrets. The other members of the group had been initially skeptical, but Thomas's enthusiasm and apparent scholarly insights had gradually won them over. As David continued his confession, Dr. Whitley began to understand the full scope of what had been happening at the seminary. The secret study group had been meeting for nearly 3 months before the first death, studying the mysterious book and apparently experiencing effects that they had interpreted as spiritual enlightenment. David described how the group members had begun to feel superior to their fellow students, believing they had been chosen to receive special knowledge that would make them extraordinary ministers. The group's activities had not gone entirely unnoticed. Several students had reported seeing lights in the chapel at unusual hours, and some had heard strange sounds coming from the building during the night. Dr. Ashford had investigated these reports but found nothing amiss during his inspections. The group had been careful to cover their tracks, meeting only when they were certain the faculty was asleep and always returning the book to its hiding place before dawn. David revealed that the book contained not only text, but also detailed instructions for various spiritual exercises and practices. Some of these involved meditation techniques that were unlike anything taught in Orthodox Presbyterian theology. Others included dietary restrictions, specific prayers to be recited at particular times, and even instructions for creating what the book described as spiritual preparation chambers, using candles, incense, and geometric patterns drawn on the floor. The group had begun implementing these practices, initially with what seemed like positive results. They reported experiencing vivid dreams in which they seemed to communicate with angelic beings who revealed profound truths about the nature of God and creation. They felt more spiritually alive than ever before, and their academic performance actually improved as they applied insights from their secret studies to their regular coursework. But as David continued his account, it became clear that the supposed benefits had come with a price. The members of the group had begun to experience physical symptoms that they initially dismissed as signs of spiritual transformation. They suffered from headaches, insomnia, and strange sensations in their hands and feet. Their appetites changed, and they found themselves craving foods that they had never eaten before, particularly meat that was barely cooked. Thomas, as the group's leader and the one who had discovered the book, experienced the most severe symptoms. He began to complain of a constant burning sensation in his stomach and reported that he could sometimes hear voices speaking to him in languages he didn't recognize. But instead of being alarmed by these symptoms, he had convinced himself and the others that they were signs of spiritual advancement, evidence that their souls were being prepared for higher forms of divine communication. The group had also begun to notice changes in their relationships with other students and faculty. They found themselves becoming impatient with what they saw as the simplistic theology taught in their regular classes. They looked down on their classmates who seemed content with ordinary spiritual experiences and conventional understanding of Scripture. They began to see themselves as an elite group, chosen by God for special revelation and destined for extraordinary ministries. Marcus Hartwell, the eldest member of the group, had begun to have doubts about their activities in November. He told David that he had started experiencing nightmares in which the angelic beings they thought they were communicating with revealed themselves to be something far more sinister. In these dreams, the beautiful faces transformed into hideous masks, and the divine wisdom they offered turned into blasphemous mockeries of sacred truth. Marcus had wanted to end the group's meetings and return the book to its hiding place, but Thomas had convinced him that his doubts were a test of his faith and commitment to the advanced knowledge they were receiving. Thomas argued that spiritual progress always involved periods of testing, and that Marcus was being challenged to demonstrate his worthiness to receive higher revelations. The pressure within the group to continue their studies had been intense. Thomas had become increasingly obsessed with the book and spent hours copying passages and creating his own interpretations of the symbols and diagrams. He had begun to speak of their group as the chosen ones and claimed that they were being prepared for a special mission that would transform the Presbyterian Church and American Christianity. As David's confession continued, Dr. Whitley began to piece together a timeline that connected the group's activities to the pattern of deaths. The first symptoms had appeared in late November, beginning with Thomas but gradually affecting all members of the group. The physical symptoms had been accompanied by psychological changes that included increased aggression, paranoia, and a growing sense of superiority over others. The book had also contained warnings about the consequences of improper study or abandoning the practices once they had been begun. According to David, there were passages that suggested terrible punishments for those who proved unworthy of the knowledge they had received. The text implied that those who began the spiritual journey outlined in the book but failed to complete it would face divine judgment in the form of physical and spiritual destruction. When Dr. Whitley pressed David about the current location of the book, the young man's face went pale and his voice dropped to barely a whisper. He revealed that the book had disappeared from its hiding place 3 days before Thomas's death. The group had gathered for their regular meeting on November 30th, only to find the hidden compartment empty. They had searched the entire chapel, but found no trace of the book or any sign that someone else had discovered their secret. The disappearance of the book had thrown the group into a panic. Thomas had been convinced that someone had discovered their activities and stolen the book to prevent them from completing their studies. He had become increasingly agitated and paranoid, accusing fellow students and even faculty members of spying on them and working to undermine their spiritual progress. In the days following the book's disappearance, the group members had begun experiencing more severe symptoms. The headaches became constant, the insomnia worsened, and they began to have shared nightmares in which they were pursued by dark figures who demanded that they return something they had stolen. Thomas had interpreted these experiences as signs that they were being tested and that they needed to prove their commitment to the spiritual path they had begun. David's revelation cast the deaths in an entirely new light. If the victims had all been part of this secret study group, their deaths might not be the result of disease or natural causes at all. They might be connected to whatever spiritual or psychological processes had been triggered by their study of the mysterious book. Dr. Whitley found himself grappling with possibilities that lay outside his medical training and scientific worldview. The implications of David's confession were staggering. If the book contained some form of dangerous knowledge or practices that had somehow caused the deaths, then the seminary might be dealing with something far more complex than a medical epidemic. Dr. Whitley realized that he needed to share this information with Dr. Blackwood immediately, as the church officials' experience with theological controversies might provide insights that medical science could not offer. The discovery of the secret study group sent shockwaves through the seminary community when Dr. Whitley shared David's confession with Dr. Blackwood. The church official's reaction was immediate and decisive. He ordered a full investigation, interrogating every student and faculty member about their knowledge of the group and the mysterious book. What he uncovered was a conspiracy of silence that had been maintained for months, with nearly half the student body aware of the secret meetings but too frightened to speak out. Dr. Blackwood's investigation revealed the depth of the deception that had been occurring under the seminary's roof. Students came forward with accounts of seeing lights in the chapel at unusual hours, hearing strange chanting and unfamiliar prayers, and noticing changes in the behavior of the group members. Several admitted that they had been approached by Thomas Millikan about joining the group but had declined, either from suspicion about the secretive nature of the activities or from concern about violating seminary rules. Professor Hartley revealed that he had noticed changes in the academic performance and behavior of several students, including Thomas, James, Samuel, and Peter. While their scholarly work had initially improved, they had become increasingly argumentative during class discussions and had begun to challenge orthodox theological positions in ways that seemed designed to provoke controversy rather than engage in legitimate scholarly debate. Professor Sterling reported similar observations about the group members' behavior during his church history lectures. They had become dismissive of traditional Presbyterian teaching and had begun to express ideas that seemed to draw from sources outside the approved curriculum. When questioned about their sources, they had been evasive and claimed to be developing their own theological insights through prayer and meditation. The truth that emerged from Dr. Blackwood's investigation was more disturbing than anyone had imagined. The secret study group had been operating for nearly 3 months, meeting twice weekly in the chapel after evening prayers. The group had consisted of 6 students: Thomas Millikan, James Morrison, Samuel Brewster, Peter Cunningham, David Crane, and Marcus Hartwell. They had been studying the contents of the mysterious book and implementing practices that were clearly outside the bounds of Orthodox Presbyterian theology. According to testimony from multiple witnesses, the group members had begun to exhibit signs of spiritual pride and exclusivity that were completely contrary to the humility and unity that the seminary sought to foster. They had formed an inner circle that looked down on their fellow students and seemed to believe they had access to superior spiritual knowledge. This attitude had created tension and division within the student body, though few had understood the source of the problem. Dr. Blackwood's experience with theological controversies had taught him to recognize the warning signs of heretical movements and spiritual deception. The behavior described by witnesses, the secrecy, the claims of special revelation, the growing sense of superiority, and the departure from orthodox teaching all pointed to a classic pattern of spiritual corruption that he had encountered in other contexts. The church official also noted the significance of the fact that the deaths had begun only after the book had disappeared from its hiding place. This suggested that the book itself might not be the direct cause of the deaths, but rather that the deaths might be connected to the spiritual and psychological processes that had been set in motion by the group's activities. Dr. Blackwood ordered a thorough search of the chapel, despite Dr. Ashford's continued reluctance to disturb the sacred space. The search revealed the hidden compartment that David had described, along with evidence that it had recently been occupied. The compartment contained traces of wax from candles, ashes from burned materials, and faint markings on the walls that suggested the presence of symbols or diagrams that had been partially erased. The search also revealed other disturbing evidence of the group's activities. Behind the altar, investigators found geometric patterns carved into the floor that had been covered with rugs during regular services. These patterns were unlike anything found in Orthodox Christian art or architecture, and seemed to serve some ritual purpose that remained unclear. Most significantly, the search uncovered a collection of papers hidden in a different location within the chapel. These papers contained handwritten notes and copies of passages from the mysterious book, apparently made by Thomas Millikan during the group's studies. The notes revealed the extent of the group's departure from Orthodox Christianity and provided insight into the nature of the knowledge they had been pursuing. The notes described spiritual practices that involved direct communication with supernatural entities, techniques for achieving altered states of consciousness, and methods for gaining power over other people through spiritual manipulation. The language used was a mixture of Christian terminology and concepts that seemed to draw from occult traditions that were completely foreign to Presbyterian theology. One particularly disturbing passage, copied in Thomas's handwriting, described a ritual for opening the gates between worlds that required the participation of 6 individuals who would serve as vessels for divine manifestation. The ritual promised to grant the participants enhanced spiritual powers and direct access to divine knowledge, but it also warned of severe consequences for those who proved unworthy or who attempted to abandon the process once it had begun. Dr. Whitley realized that the group had unknowingly been performing some version of this ritual through their regular meetings and study sessions. Their focus on the book's contents, combined with their implementation of the spiritual practices it described, had apparently initiated a process that was now claiming their lives one by one. The 5th death occurred on December 21st, claiming Marcus Hartwell himself. The timing was particularly significant, as Marcus had been the one member of the group who had expressed doubts about their activities and had wanted to end their meetings. His death followed the same pattern as the previous 4, but his final words were different and more revealing. Instead of referencing the book in the chapel, Marcus spoke repeatedly of being chosen and marked for the harvest. His words suggested that he understood something about the nature of what was happening to the group members, though he died before he could provide any clear explanation. Dr. Whitley noted this deviation from the pattern, wondering if it might provide a clue to understanding the mysterious deaths. David Crane was now the only surviving member of the original study group, a fact that was not lost on anyone at the seminary. The students and faculty watched him with a mixture of sympathy and suspicion, wondering if he would be the next victim or if he might hold the key to stopping the deaths. David himself was consumed with guilt and terror, convinced that he would soon follow his friends into death. The psychological pressure on David was enormous. He was isolated from his classmates by his knowledge of the secret group and his role in their activities, yet he was also the only person who could provide information that might prevent further deaths. Dr. Blackwood and Dr. Whitley spent hours questioning him about every detail of the group's activities, hoping to find some clue that might break the deadly pattern. David revealed that the book had contained detailed prophecies about what would happen to those who studied its contents. According to these prophecies, the 6 members of the group were destined to serve as bridges between worlds, allowing supernatural entities to manifest in the physical realm. The process would require the sacrifice of their physical lives, but their souls would be elevated to a higher plane of existence where they would serve as intermediaries between the divine and mortal realms. The prophecies also suggested that the process, once begun, could not be stopped or reversed. The 6 members of the group had been marked by their study of the book and their participation in the ritual practices it described. They were bound together by spiritual forces that would claim their lives at predetermined intervals, using their life energy to fuel the manifestation of supernatural entities in the physical world. Dr. Whitley had begun to suspect that the deaths might be connected to some form of mass hysteria or shared delusion that had been triggered by the group's activities. The power of suggestion, combined with guilt and fear about their secret activities, might have created psychological conditions that manifested as physical symptoms. However, the precision of the timing and the consistency of the symptoms made this explanation seem inadequate. Dr. Blackwood, drawing on his experience with theological controversies and spiritual deception, believed that the group had become involved with genuinely dangerous spiritual forces. He was convinced that their study of the book and their implementation of its practices had opened them to demonic influence that was now claiming their lives as the price for their spiritual arrogance and departure from orthodox faith. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in Whitmore Seminary intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next, because the truth about that mysterious book is about to be revealed in ways that will challenge everything you believe about good and evil. The tension at the seminary reached a breaking point on December 22nd when David Crane, unable to bear the weight of his knowledge and guilt any longer, made a desperate decision. He had been experiencing the same physical symptoms that had preceded the deaths of his friends: headaches, insomnia, and a burning sensation in his stomach. Convinced that he would be the next victim, he decided to make one final attempt to understand what had happened to them and possibly find a way to break the deadly pattern. David's search for answers led him to explore parts of the seminary that had been abandoned or forgotten since its construction. He had remembered Thomas mentioning that the book seemed much older than the seminary itself, which suggested that it might have been hidden in the chapel before the building was even completed. This possibility led David to investigate the history of the land and the circumstances surrounding the seminary's founding. His search took him to the basement of the main building, where old construction materials and abandoned furniture were stored. It was there, behind a wall that had been bricked up decades earlier, that he made a discovery that would change everything they thought they knew about Whitmore Seminary and the mysterious book that had cost his friends their lives. The hidden chamber that David uncovered was small, but filled with items that clearly predated the seminary's construction. There were books, documents, personal effects, and artifacts that suggested someone had deliberately concealed these materials before the building was completed. Most importantly, the chamber contained evidence of the true identity of the man for whom the seminary had been named. The documents David discovered painted a picture of the Reverend Josiah Whitmore that was completely different from the heroic Revolutionary War minister that the seminary's founders had believed they were honoring. The real Josiah Whitmore had indeed been a minister, but he had also been involved in occult practices that had scandalized his congregation and ultimately led to his expulsion from the Presbyterian Church. According to the documents, Whitmore had been ordained as a Presbyterian minister in 1768 and had served a congregation in eastern Pennsylvania for several years. However, he had gradually become involved with mystical and occult practices that he claimed would enhance his spiritual powers and make him a more effective minister. He had begun to incorporate elements of folk magic, astrology, and ceremonial magic into his religious practice, justifying these departures from Orthodox Christianity as advanced forms of spiritual knowledge. Whitmore's congregation had initially been impressed by his apparent spiritual gifts and his claims of receiving direct revelations from God. However, as his practices became more extreme and his teachings more divergent from Presbyterian doctrine, opposition had begun to grow. Several church members had accused him of practicing witchcraft and consorting with evil spirits, charges that Whitmore had vehemently denied while continuing to pursue his occult studies. The situation had come to a head in 1781 when Whitmore had attempted to perform what he described as a great working that would permanently open communication between the physical and spiritual worlds. The ritual had required the participation of 6 volunteers from his congregation, whom he had convinced to serve as vessels for divine manifestation. The ritual had taken place in the church during a secret meeting attended only by Whitmore's most devoted followers. According to the documents, the ritual had gone terribly wrong. Instead of achieving divine communication, the 6 participants had all died within hours of the ceremony, their bodies found in the church the next morning in a state that witnesses described as horrifying. The exact nature of their condition was not detailed in the documents, but references to blackened extremities and blasphemous utterances suggested disturbing similarities to what had been happening at the seminary. The deaths had caused an immediate scandal that had spread throughout the Pennsylvania Presbyterian community. Whitmore had been arrested and charged with murder, though he had maintained his innocence and claimed that the deaths were the result of divine judgment on those who had proven unworthy of the spiritual advancement he had offered them. The trial had been brief and decisive. Multiple witnesses had testified about Whitmore's occult practices and his departure from Orthodox Christian teaching. The physical evidence found in the church, including ritual implements, occult books, and geometric patterns carved into the floor, had convinced the jury that Whitmore had indeed been practicing witchcraft, and that his activities had directly caused the deaths of the 6 congregation members. Josiah Whitmore had been convicted of witchcraft and murder, and had been executed in 1782, not dying heroically in the Revolutionary War, as the seminary's official history claimed. His personal library and ritual implements had been confiscated by church authorities, who had intended to destroy them, but had apparently decided instead to hide them away where they could not cause further harm. The documents revealed that the land where Whitmore Seminary had been built was the same property where Josiah Whitmore had conducted his occult practices, and where the 6 members of his congregation had died. The seminary's founders had been unaware of this history, having been told that they were honoring a martyred patriot rather than a convicted witch and murderer. Most significantly, David discovered that the mysterious book that had been the focus of his study group was Whitmore's personal grimoire, a collection of occult knowledge and ritual instructions that he had compiled over years of study and practice. The book contained not only the spiritual exercises that the group had been performing, but also detailed accounts of Whitmore's experiments in supernatural communication and his theories about opening permanent gateways between the physical and spiritual worlds. The grimoire explained why the book had been hidden in the chapel and why it had such a powerful effect on those who studied it. Whitmore had deliberately consecrated the land for his occult practices and had designed his rituals to create permanent spiritual openings that would allow supernatural entities to manifest in the physical world. The book had been placed in the chapel as a trap for anyone who might discover it, ensuring that Whitmore's work would continue even after his death. According to the grimoire's instructions, the ritual that Whitmore had attempted required the life force of 6 participants to fuel the opening of gateways between worlds. The deaths were not a failure of the ritual, but rather its intended outcome, providing the spiritual energy necessary for supernatural entities to establish a permanent presence in the physical realm. David realized with growing horror that he and his friends had unknowingly been repeating Whitmore's failed experiment. Their study sessions had gradually prepared them to serve as the 6 vessels required for the ritual, and their deaths were not random tragedies, but necessary sacrifices for a process that had been set in motion over 40 years earlier. The grimoire also contained information about how the ritual might be interrupted or prevented, though the methods described were as dangerous as the ritual itself. According to Whitmore's notes, breaking the ritual would require destroying the grimoire and performing a counter-ritual that would sever the connection between the physical and spiritual worlds. However, the grimoire warned that attempting to break the ritual would result in the immediate death of any remaining vessels, as the supernatural entities would claim their lives to prevent the interruption of the process. Armed with this terrible knowledge, David Crane faced an impossible choice. He could attempt to break the ritual and save the seminary from further tragedy, but doing so would almost certainly cost him his own life. Alternatively, he could allow the process to continue and hope that his death would complete the ritual and end the threat to others, though the grimoire suggested that the successful completion of Whitmore's work would have consequences that extended far beyond the seminary. David spent the night of December 22nd wrestling with this decision, reading through Whitmore's notes and trying to understand the full implications of what he and his friends had unleashed. The physical symptoms that had preceded his friends' deaths were now affecting him more severely, and he could feel his time running out. The burning sensation in his stomach had intensified, and he had begun to experience the same auditory hallucinations that Thomas had described. By dawn on December 23rd, David had made his decision. He sought out Dr. Whitley and Dr. Blackwood and revealed everything he had discovered about the seminary's dark origins and the true nature of the book that had killed his friends. The 2 men listened in stunned silence as David explained Josiah Whitmore's history and the ritual that had been claiming the lives of the study group members. Dr. Whitley, as a man of science and medicine, struggled to accept the supernatural elements of David's account. However, the precision of the deaths, the consistency of the symptoms, and the historical evidence that David had uncovered made it impossible to dismiss his conclusions entirely. The doctor found himself forced to consider possibilities that lay completely outside his medical training and scientific worldview. Dr. Blackwood, drawing on his extensive experience with theological controversies and church history, was more prepared to accept the possibility that supernatural forces might be involved. He had encountered other cases of occult practices within Christian communities and knew that such activities often led to tragic consequences, though he had never seen anything as systematic and deadly as what was happening at the seminary. The 3 men gathered in Dr. Blackwood's quarters to examine the evidence that David had uncovered and to decide on a course of action. The grimoire's instructions for breaking the ritual were clear but terrifying. They would need to destroy the book while performing a counter-ritual that would sever the spiritual connections that Whitmore had established. The process would be dangerous for everyone involved, but particularly for David as the remaining vessel. Dr. Blackwood insisted on involving Dr. Ashford in their planning, despite the seminary head's continued reluctance to accept supernatural explanations for the deaths. When confronted with the historical evidence and the grimoire itself, Dr. Ashford was forced to acknowledge that the seminary community was facing something far more complex than a medical epidemic. The decision was made to attempt the counter-ritual on the night of December 23rd, using the instructions provided in Whitmore's grimoire, but adapting them to reflect Orthodox Christian theology rather than occult practices. Dr. Blackwood would lead the ritual, drawing on his knowledge of Presbyterian liturgy and his experience with spiritual warfare. Dr. Whitley and Dr. Ashford would assist, while David would serve as the focal point for breaking the spiritual connections that bound him to the other group members. The 4 men gathered in the chapel as midnight approached, bringing with them the grimoire and the materials needed for the counter-ritual. The chapel felt different than it had during regular services, colder, more oppressive, and filled with a sense of spiritual presence that was clearly malevolent. The air itself seemed to thicken as they prepared for the ritual, making it difficult to breathe and causing their candles to flicker despite the absence of any breeze. Dr. Blackwood began the counter-ritual by reading passages from Scripture that specifically addressed spiritual warfare and divine protection. He called upon God to break the evil influences that had taken hold of the seminary, and to protect those who sought to oppose the forces of darkness. His voice was strong and confident, though the others could see the strain in his face as he confronted spiritual realities that challenged even his experienced faith. As the ritual progressed, David began to experience the familiar symptoms that had preceded his friends' deaths. His hands began to shake, and his fingernails started to darken with the same black discoloration that had marked the other victims. However, instead of the violent convulsions that had characterized the previous deaths, he remained conscious and able to participate in the counter-ritual. The climactic moment came when they began to burn the grimoire, page by page, while reciting prayers for divine protection and spiritual cleansing. As each page was consumed by flames, the spiritual oppression in the chapel seemed to intensify. The temperature dropped dramatically, shadows moved across the walls despite the steady flame of their candles, and they could hear sounds that seemed to come from beneath the floor, grinding, scraping noises that suggested something trying to break through from below. David spoke words that seemed to come from some source beyond himself, describing visions of his dead friends who were trapped between worlds and unable to find peace. He said that he could see the supernatural entities that had been feeding on their life force, beings of darkness and malevolence that had been given access to the physical world through Whitmore's ritual and the study group's unwitting participation. The entities were furious about the attempt to break the ritual and were threatening to claim everyone in the seminary as punishment for the interference. David could feel them trying to take complete control of his body and mind, using him as a conduit to manifest fully in the physical world. The counter-ritual was preventing them from achieving complete dominance, but the struggle was tearing him apart both physically and spiritually. As the last page of the grimoire was consumed by flames, David let out a scream that seemed to shake the very foundations of the chapel. For a moment, the others thought they had lost him to the same fate that had claimed his friends. The black discoloration had spread up his arms, his body convulsed with violent spasms, and his voice became guttural and inhuman as the entities made their final attempt to claim him. But then, suddenly, everything changed. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, the temperature returned to normal, and the supernatural sounds ceased. David collapsed to the floor, unconscious but breathing, his skin returning to its normal color as the black discoloration faded away. The counter-ritual had worked, but at a cost that would mark David for the rest of his life. David Crane survived the night, but he was forever changed by his experience with forces that lay beyond human understanding. The young man who had entered Whitmore Seminary with dreams of serving God on the frontier emerged from the chapel as someone who had looked into the abyss and barely escaped with his soul intact. He would spend the rest of his life as a minister, but he never spoke publicly about what had happened at the seminary, and he never married or had children, as if he feared passing on some spiritual contamination to future generations. The deaths at Whitmore Seminary ended with the destruction of the grimoire and the completion of the counter-ritual, but the institution never recovered from the tragedy that had claimed 15 young lives. The Presbyterian Church authorities, faced with the historical evidence of Josiah Whitmore's true identity and the occult origins of the seminary's location, decided to close the institution permanently. The official reason given was the need to relocate to a more accessible location. But those involved in the investigation understood the real motivation for the closure. Dr. Ashford resigned his position as head of the seminary and accepted a pastorate in a small Pennsylvania town, where he spent the remainder of his career serving a quiet, rural congregation. He never spoke publicly about the events at Whitmore Seminary, though his family noted that he became much more conservative in his theological views and was deeply suspicious of any claims of special revelation or advanced spiritual knowledge. Professor Hartley and Professor Sterling both found positions at other Presbyterian institutions, though their experiences at Whitmore had left them wary of student activities that took place outside the regular curriculum. They became advocates for stricter oversight of seminary communities and more careful screening of students for signs of spiritual pride or heretical tendencies. The surviving students were transferred to other Presbyterian seminaries to complete their education, though many struggled with the trauma of their experiences. Several left the ministry entirely, unable to reconcile their faith with the supernatural horrors they had witnessed. Others became exceptionally orthodox in their theology, as if seeking to protect themselves from any hint of the spiritual dangers they had encountered. Dr. Whitley's medical practice never recovered from his experience at the seminary. The rational, scientific worldview that had guided his career had been shattered by events that defied medical explanation. He moved to a different county shortly after the incident and began drinking heavily, struggling to cope with memories that challenged everything he had believed about the nature of reality. He eventually died of liver disease in 1835, his family reporting that he suffered from terrible nightmares for the rest of his life and would often wake up screaming about blackened fingernails and blasphemous Latin phrases. Dr. Blackwood returned to his administrative duties in Philadelphia, but the experience at Whitmore Seminary had profoundly affected his understanding of spiritual warfare and the reality of supernatural evil. He became one of the Presbyterian Church's leading experts on identifying and combating occult influences within Christian communities, though he was careful never to discuss the specific details of what had happened at the seminary. The buildings at Whitmore Seminary were abandoned and eventually sold to a private buyer who was unaware of their dark history. The main building was converted into a private residence, while the other structures were either demolished or repurposed for agricultural use. The chapel where the grimoire had been discovered and destroyed was converted into a living room, though visitors often commented on the room's unusual atmosphere, describing it as cold and oppressive, even on warm days. The cemetery where the 15 victims were buried was moved to make way for agricultural improvements, and the bodies were reinterred in a public cemetery in Millbrook. The graves were marked with simple stones that gave only the names and dates of death, with no mention of their connection to the seminary or the circumstances of their deaths. Over time, even these modest memorials were forgotten, and the location of the graves became lost to local memory. Dr. Whitley's medical notes from the incident were sealed by church authorities and deposited in the Presbyterian Historical Society's archives, where they remained classified for nearly 2 centuries. The official cause of death for all 15 victims was listed as consumption complicated by nervous exhaustion, a diagnosis that satisfied public curiosity but concealed the true nature of the tragedy. The church's investigation reports and Dr. Blackwood's recommendations for preventing similar incidents were also classified and stored alongside Dr. Whitley's notes. The letters that David Crane wrote to his family during and after the incident were discovered in 2019 when his great-great-grandson was cleaning out an old trunk in the family's attic. These letters, along with Dr. Whitley's notes and fragments of the church investigation, provide the only surviving account of what really happened at Whitmore Seminary during that terrible winter of 1823-1824. David's letters reveal the profound impact that the experience had on his understanding of good and evil, faith and doubt, and the dangers of spiritual pride. He wrote extensively about the seductive nature of the forbidden knowledge that the group had pursued, and the gradual way that their pursuit of spiritual advancement had led them away from orthodox Christian faith. He expressed deep remorse for his role in the tragedy and spent the rest of his life trying to atone for his participation in activities that had cost his friends their lives. The letters also reveal David's ongoing struggle with guilt and trauma in the years following the incident. He was haunted by vivid nightmares in which he relived the deaths of his friends and was tormented by the possibility that he might somehow be responsible for their fates. He sought counseling from several ministers and theologians, though he was never able to find complete peace with what had happened. David's ministry career was marked by exceptional orthodoxy and a deep suspicion of any claims of special revelation or advanced spiritual knowledge. He served several rural Pennsylvania congregations, focusing on practical pastoral care and biblical preaching rather than theological speculation. His sermons were noted for their emphasis on humility, the dangers of spiritual pride, and the importance of remaining within the bounds of Orthodox Christian teaching. The mystery of Whitmore Seminary serves as a chilling reminder of the dangers that can arise when spiritual pride and the pursuit of forbidden knowledge lead people away from the safety of Orthodox faith and community accountability. The 15 young men who died had been sincere in their desire to serve God, but their ambition to become extraordinary ministers had led them to seek shortcuts to spiritual power that ultimately destroyed them. The story also illustrates the way that past evils can continue to influence present events, as Josiah Whitmore's occult practices created spiritual openings that remained active for decades after his death. The seminary's founders had been completely unaware that they were building on cursed ground, but their ignorance did not protect the institution from the consequences of its dark heritage. The Presbyterian Church's response to the tragedy reflects the institution's commitment to protecting its members from spiritual dangers while maintaining the confidentiality necessary to prevent panic and scandal. The decision to classify the investigation reports and relocate the surviving students demonstrated both pastoral concern and institutional wisdom in dealing with events that challenged conventional understanding. The long-term effects of the Whitmore Seminary incident can be seen in the Presbyterian Church's subsequent policies regarding seminary oversight and student activities. The Church implemented stricter controls over extracurricular activities, required more frequent faculty supervision of student gatherings, and established formal protocols for investigating unusual incidents at church institutions. These changes, while never explicitly connected to the Whitmore tragedy, reflected lessons learned from an experience that had nearly destroyed one of the Church's most promising educational ventures. The incident also influenced Presbyterian theological education in more subtle ways. Seminary curricula began to include more explicit warnings about the dangers of spiritual pride and the pursuit of esoteric knowledge outside the bounds of Orthodox Christianity. Professors were trained to recognize signs of heretical thinking and to intervene before students could be led astray by claims of special revelation or advanced spiritual techniques. Modern scholars who have studied the available documents from the Whitmore Seminary incident have proposed various explanations for what occurred during that terrible winter. Some suggest that the deaths were the result of mass hysteria triggered by guilt and fear over the group's secret activities. According to this theory, the power of suggestion, combined with the isolation and stress of seminary life, created psychological conditions that manifested as physical symptoms severe enough to cause death. Others have proposed that the group may have been experimenting with psychoactive substances that were included in the mysterious book's instructions, leading to poisoning that caused the consistent symptoms and timing of the deaths. This theory is supported by historical evidence that some occult practitioners of the period did use various herbs and compounds in their rituals, some of which were known to be toxic in certain combinations or dosages. A third group of scholars has suggested that the deaths may have been the result of deliberate poisoning by someone who discovered the group's activities and decided to eliminate them to protect the seminary's reputation. This theory would explain the precision of the timing and symptoms, as well as the disappearance of the book from its hiding place. However, no evidence has ever been found to support this explanation, and it fails to account for many of the incident's more unusual aspects. Religious scholars and theologians have generally been more willing to accept the possibility that supernatural forces were involved in the Whitmore Seminary deaths. They point to the consistent pattern of blasphemous utterances, the precise timing of the deaths, and the historical evidence of Josiah Whitmore's occult practices as support for the theory that the students had indeed encountered malevolent spiritual entities through their study of the grimoire. These scholars argue that the incident serves as a powerful reminder of the reality of spiritual warfare and the importance of maintaining Orthodox Christian faith and practice. They see the tragedy as a cautionary tale about the dangers of seeking spiritual knowledge outside the bounds of established church teaching and the protective authority of Christian community. The current owners of the property, where Whitmore Seminary once stood, remain unaware of its dark history. The main building has been extensively renovated and expanded over the years, with modern additions that have eliminated most traces of its original architecture. The family that purchased the property in the 1850s converted it into a working farm, and their descendants continue to raise crops and livestock on the land where 15 young men died pursuing forbidden knowledge. Local historians in the Millbrook area have occasionally noted the existence of the former seminary, but most residents are unaware of the tragedy that led to its closure. The official Presbyterian Church history of the period mentions Whitmore Seminary only briefly, noting that it operated from 1819 to 1824 before being relocated due to transportation difficulties. This sanitized version of events has effectively erased the memory of what really happened during that terrible winter 2 centuries ago. The chapel where the secret study group conducted their meetings and where the counter-ritual was performed has been completely transformed. What was once a sacred space dedicated to Christian worship is now a comfortable family room with modern furnishings and no trace of its religious origins. Visitors to the house sometimes comment on an unusual atmosphere in this particular room, a sense of coldness and oppression that persists even on warm days. But the current owners attribute this to the building's age and the room's northern exposure. The cemetery where the 15 victims were originally buried has been completely obliterated by 2 centuries of agricultural activity. The bodies were moved in the 1840s, when the land was converted to farming. But even the public cemetery where they were reinterred has undergone changes that have obscured their final resting places. The simple stones that once marked their graves have been replaced or removed, and their names are no longer associated with any particular location. Perhaps most significantly, the spiritual contamination that Josiah Whitmore sought to create on the property appears to have been successfully cleansed by the counter-ritual performed by Dr. Blackwood and his companions. Unlike other locations associated with occult practices, the former seminary grounds show no signs of ongoing supernatural activity. The land has been productive and peaceful for nearly 2 centuries, suggesting that David Crane's sacrifice and the destruction of the grimoire effectively severed the spiritual connections that had made the tragedy possible. The story of Whitmore Seminary ultimately serves as both a historical mystery and a spiritual cautionary tale. It reminds us that the pursuit of knowledge, even knowledge presented in religious terms, can become dangerous when it leads away from humility, community accountability, and orthodox faith. The 15 young men who died were not evil people, but they were proud people who believed they could handle spiritual forces that were beyond their understanding and control. Their deaths also demonstrate the way that past sins can continue to affect future generations, as Josiah Whitmore's occult practices created conditions that would claim innocent lives decades after his own execution. The seminary's founders had no way of knowing that they were building on cursed ground, but their ignorance did not protect the institution from the consequences of its dark heritage. The response of the church authorities to the crisis shows both the strengths and limitations of institutional religion when confronted with supernatural evil. Dr. Blackwood's willingness to take spiritual warfare seriously and to act decisively in the face of unexplained deaths probably saved the seminary community from even greater tragedy. However, the church's subsequent decision to suppress information about the incident, while understandable from a pastoral perspective, has prevented future generations from learning important lessons about spiritual discernment and the reality of supernatural evil. The medical profession's response to the incident, as represented by Dr. Whitley's experience, illustrates the limitations of purely naturalistic approaches to understanding human experience. Dr. Whitley's scientific training prepared him to diagnose and treat physical ailments, but it left him completely unprepared to deal with phenomena that appeared to have spiritual rather than material causes. His subsequent alcoholism and early death suggest that some experiences are too traumatic to be processed within a purely secular worldview. David Crane's survival and his subsequent ministry career demonstrate that it is possible to encounter supernatural evil and emerge spiritually intact, but only through reliance on divine protection and orthodox Christian faith. His willingness to sacrifice his own life to save others reflects the highest ideals of Christian service, while his lifelong struggle with trauma shows the lasting effects that such experiences can have on those who survive them. The gradual fading of memory about the Whitmore Seminary incident reflects broader cultural changes in American society's understanding of spiritual reality. In 1823, most Americans still believed in the reality of supernatural forces and the possibility of spiritual warfare. By the late 19th century, scientific materialism had begun to replace religious explanations for unusual phenomena, making it easier for incidents like the Whitmore tragedy to be forgotten or reinterpreted in naturalistic terms. Today, the story of Whitmore Seminary challenges both religious and secular worldviews. For believers, it serves as a reminder that spiritual warfare is real and that the pursuit of religious knowledge must be balanced by humility and submission to orthodox teaching. For skeptics, it presents a historical puzzle that resists easy explanation and forces consideration of possibilities that lie outside the bounds of materialistic thinking. The recently discovered letters and documents that have brought the Whitmore Seminary story to light also raise questions about what other secrets might be hidden in family attics and church archives across America. How many other incidents of supernatural activity have been forgotten or suppressed over the centuries? What lessons might be learned from tragedies that were deliberately erased from historical memory? The story also speaks to contemporary concerns about the dangers of spiritual pride and the pursuit of esoteric knowledge outside the bounds of established religious authority. In an age when alternative spiritualities and claims of special revelation are increasingly common, the fate of the Whitmore Seminary Study Group serves as a warning about the potential consequences of abandoning traditional safeguards and community accountability. The 15 young men who died at Whitmore Seminary were guilty of nothing more than ambition and curiosity, qualities that are generally considered virtues in American culture. Their tragedy reminds us that even positive character traits can become dangerous when they lead away from humility and wisdom. Their desire to become extraordinary ministers led them to seek shortcuts to spiritual power that ultimately destroyed them and left lasting scars on all who knew them. The Presbyterian Church's handling of the incident, while successful in preventing immediate panic and scandal, also demonstrates the costs of institutional secrecy. By suppressing information about what had happened, church authorities protected their organization's reputation, but also ensured that future generations would be unable to learn from the tragedy. The recent discovery of hidden documents suggests that other important historical events may have been similarly concealed, waiting for accident or providence to bring them to light. Perhaps most importantly, the story of Whitmore Seminary serves as a reminder that human beings are spiritual as well as physical creatures, and that our spiritual choices have real consequences that extend beyond our individual lives. The occult practices of Josiah Whitmore created spiritual conditions that affected innocent people decades after his death, while the faithful response of David Crane and his companions restored spiritual health to a contaminated location. In our increasingly secular age, stories like that of Whitmore Seminary challenge us to consider the possibility that spiritual realities are as important as physical ones, and that our choices about faith, morality, and religious practice have consequences that extend far beyond what we can see or measure. Whether we interpret the events in supernatural or psychological terms, the tragedy serves as a powerful reminder of the importance of humility, community accountability, and careful discernment in all matters of faith and spirituality. This mystery shows us that the most terrifying evils often grow from the purest intentions, and that the road to damnation can be paved with sincere desires to serve God. The story of Whitmore Seminary is not just a tale of supernatural horror, but a meditation on the dangers of spiritual pride, and the importance of maintaining humility in our relationship with the divine. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or do you think there are still secrets buried in the ruins of that Pennsylvania seminary? Leave your comment below and tell us what you think really happened during that terrible winter of 1823. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries as much as you do. Until next time, remember that some secrets are meant to stay buried, and some knowledge is too dangerous to seek. See you in the next video.